Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, a comparatively young library that sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am on Gadigal land and I pay my sincere respect to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here with us this morning. Thank you. It's great to have your company for another episode of our Fellows Findings series, where our fellows talk in depth about their research project as part of the fellowship program here at the library. I'm Rachel Franks, and it's my job to look after the fellows, which is a terrific privilege to engage with them and all of the skills and talents and knowledge that they bring to the program. And of course, they're fascinating topics. I don't want to give away too much. Dr. Caitlin de Glewis is here with us today. She's an academic at the University of Queensland, and she was also our 2024 Dr. A.M. Hertzberg AO Fellow, a fellowship which is dedicated specifically to investigating the histories of industry in New South Wales using the library's extraordinary collections. And I will say that she has done some absolutely fascinating work looking at labour in colonial Parramatta using an archaeological lens, which surprised the judges when we were reading her application, but certainly excited all of us very much. So here to share her research is Katie. Thanks so much.
Hello, thank you, Rachel. I will just share my screen. Is that working okay? It's all good?
Perfect.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so getting started. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for that lovely introduction and the opportunity to be here today as well. As Rachel mentioned, in 2024, I was working on a project through the State Library of New South Wales, looking at what I have called now, presenting these findings as the archaeological view of industry in colonial Parramatta. And that's through the Dr. A.M. Hertzberg AO Fellowship. Broadly, I am exploring this kind of flow of things around the workplaces of men and women in convict era Parramatta through archaeological and archival sources, including some wonderful sources from the State Library of New South Wales. I will add to Rachel's acknowledgement of country and start with my own acknowledgement on the lands on which we live and work each day. And for me, that's the Turrbal and Yagara people. And I'd also especially like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this research is based, the Darug people, and historically the Parramatta people. This photo you can see here is an interpretive inlay at the centre of Parramatta CBD, and I'm using it here to point out the kind of ongoing strength and endurance of the Darug community, despite the processes of colonisation that I'm broadly talking about today. I am an archaeologist. I study Australian history through material culture. So that's the stuff that people left behind in the ground. I'm currently a lecturer in archaeology at the University of Queensland, but I spent about a decade working as a consultant archaeologist. So this is mostly salvaging archaeological evidence before it's destroyed via development projects. There are quite a lot of archaeologists working across Australia. Many study the deep past of Indigenous peoples, but there is a field that includes the more recent parts of history. Yeah, and for Australia, that's looking at what we call historical archaeology, the study of European expansion and settlement through material remains. Here are some images of me doing archaeology. The majority of my work has been in Sydney and Parramatta. In the image of the left, I'm giving a public tour at one archaeological site I worked on, looking rather hot. The central image is me looking more disgruntled at a project known as Parramatta Square. And although I also do research elsewhere, so looking at child convicts in Tasmania, the colonisation of Norfolk Island, and in the image on the right there, working in the desert landscapes of the United Arab Emirates. study focuses on colonial Parramatta in the period prior to 1825. So the first few years encompassing the history of that small agricultural settlement, its settlers, the convicts and military, that was established in late 1788, so just after Sydney, and the growth of the urban centre of what became Parramatta in the years that followed. This is the sketch of Parramatta from 1793. And archaeologists, including myself, have found evidence of these rows of buildings that you can see there, which are mostly what we would call convict huts. And in fact, I'll show you some evidence from this particular hut on the next slide. The huts primarily were built for gangs of convict men who were building things around the settlements. So it's roads, it's agricultural land, and other public works. But there were actually houses for free families as well, convict women, government employees, and many other people. So this also includes, you can see perched up on top of the hill here, government house high above the settlement. Thinking now about what convict huts look like, they look a bit like this. They are round post holes in the ground that represent where the posts of timber structures were once located. We know that these are the huts because we have plans of Parramatta from 1792, which is shown in purple here, and 1804, which is shown in green, and they tell us where we expect to find buildings. And these post holes line up very nicely, so we can see one, the western half of this, this hut here, which aligns quite nicely there. Associated with these is plenty of evidence of people's everyday lives. So things like rubbish pits. This is a circular pit that we found on one site where they buried their waste. It's been half sectioned, so you can see the soil that was inside that pit as well. And in these rubbish pits and in the post holes and in the soil across the site, we find lots of artifacts. And these are things used by convicts and other Parramatta occupants. So you can see in this image here, we've got some blue and white ceramics in the center here, mostly introduced from China or England. We also have some locally made in brown, the lead glazed pottery you can see there. We've got a few fragments of animal bone. We've got some ferrous metals and a little bit of glass as well. The central idea of historical archaeology is that with the access to these material remains, the past lives of women or children, soldiers, sailors, convicts, ex-convicts, in fact, anyone who has ever used a dish or a chamber pot or a room or a privy or a medicine bottle might contribute to a distinctive archaeological record of the past and are therefore worthy of our study, even if their lives were mostly undocumented by official sources. For around 40 years, archaeologists have been excavating in Parramatta, mostly for the purposes of redevelopment. So this is for the creation of transport infrastructure. You can see here, this is the metro site with the Parramatta light rail in front of it. So two major recent infrastructure projects, as well as new public spaces or commercial buildings. Archaeologists have created a huge legacy of historical data, but researchers have noticed that these excavations are not really translating into narratives across the landscape. They remain very focused on the individual sites where stuff was excavated from. One way that we present archaeological evidence is through public art. This is a piece, Badu Berea, which is an artwork that integrates direct knowledge of the local landscape done by an Indigenous artist, incorporating the creek lines of that particular area, as well as these kind of real historical artifacts. You can see behind glass in the center panel here, there is some lead glazed pottery and other ceramics. Those lead glazed pieces are well and truly well over 200 years old. I'll talk a little bit about art in this presentation because I really like the way that it's creatively expressing a connection to our past and our history in other ways. At other times, excavated artifacts are put in cases with some signage, or we embed concepts in other forms like these inlays or tiles on the ground. And these we use to convey particular messages about our understanding of the past. These two photographs are from the Parramatta Square site. So that photo of me looking disgruntled earlier, that excavation turned into this archaeological cabinet and display you see here. What I'm interested in, though, is presenting other ways of thinking about these things to escape these rather kind of still or isolated interpretations of stuff from the past. And today I'm doing that using the library archives to deepen our connections between individual places and people, and by critically exploring Parramatta as a place of industry and work in the 1800s. So thinking about workplaces in the early 1800s in Parramatta, we should first frame it around colonialism. So labour was conducted as a process of colonisation or invasion. Using capitalist ideologies of things like progress or improvement, Europeans used workers to clear land and to build empires. Within that capitalist society, there was also, as there still is, a clear social stratification. At that point in time, convicts, military men, women, and government officials all had their places in that society, and that impacted the kinds of work that they were doing. Parramatta was established as a food bowl for colonial New South Wales, and this landscape was primarily made up of farmers. These were people cultivating land and growing livestock to feed the colony. In the first few years of Parramatta's history, there were really only available the materials that were either extracted from the land itself, traded or stolen from Aboriginal people, or brought with them on the infrequent ships that arrived. But over time, those trade networks grew, and we can characterise the labour and industry around these connections to the wider world and the availability of goods as well. And finally, connecting to that idea of these growing trade networks, is the kind of limited availability of goods, which promoted a concept of self-sufficiency, and this included manufacturing. So if things could not be readily imported, they should be grown or made by the settlers. This meant that while agriculture was critical, there was a lot of other manufacturing industries present. So for example, these archaeologically excavated pieces of pottery that we find, these were made by local clay, dug at the local clay fields and made by local potters. What I want to focus on now is more of my mapping methods. So I am starting with the concept of an allotment. Allotments are the spatial keys to the lives of historical people and also many archaeological investigations. Within these bounded spaces, we have evidence of the goings on of life, but not just of that allotment owner, but their families, hired workers, friends and family more broadly who visited these spaces. We also know that allotments have inputs and outputs coming to and from these spaces. So for example, people came and went to the shops or to work. They returned home from hospital. They visited the government stores or perhaps farms out of town, or potentially traded with Aboriginal people. But importantly, I want to get back to the fact that these inputs or outputs on allotments incorporated things. In fact, we can think about things as very much caught up in the labour activities within and beyond the home. A core method of this project is using what we've called the Historical Spatial Data Infrastructure, HSDI. And I use this term because it's about space, so mapping stuff, and it's about infrastructure, which means the maps are not the output of the research. They're just a research tool that we can use to support this and many other potential projects in the future. I have been working with a colleague, Dr. Nicholas Pitt, who has done most of the mapping you can see for this project as well. What you see here in green is a map of the wider Parramatta region. So each coloured area is the land that was leased or granted between 1792 and 1825. And the darker the colour, the later that occupant occupied that space. This area is where Parramatta Township is located, meaning we've mapped quite a way out in each direction from the CBD. Those little coloured areas, though, are not just bounded spaces, but they're connected to biographical data of the people who actually lived and worked on those allotments. We now have a list of who was granted or leased that land, and we've simultaneously been building a list of people who are associated with Parramatta in some way in this period. And there are around 6,600 people so far identified on this list. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of Elizabeth West in particular for slugging through these records and extracting biographical data and relationships from musters, births, deaths and marriages and other archival sources. So what we've done is linked those two data sets together and therefore introduced biographical data to those places in the landscape, the example here being Sarah Braben being linked. And that means locating that person in real terms on the map. So this is a close-up of that same map showing these leases and grants, this time zoomed in just to show the Parramatta Township. And we can do that with this data because I've made it in GIS, meaning it's interactive. You can zoom in and out to any scale at any point in time. We have virtually complete coverage of the leases and grants up to 1808 and pretty good coverage up to 1820 and a little further beyond that. And I've included here also the mapping and naming of a substantial reallocation of leases that occurred in 1823 as well. So this is a composite plan of many periods and periods of time and geographic regions kind of put into one database. It also includes town leases that don't appear on any historical map of Parramatta, and Nick has geolocated those from written descriptions or surveyor's notes about those places. So to this composite plan of allotments, we're now adding other sources. And this research relies on the transcription of two key sources from the library archives. The first is the returns of labour, so seen here on the left, from the first lumber yards in Parramatta. And I have data from 1811 and 12 and 1819 and 20, which is about 4,000 records. These itemise the products made by each trade working in the lumber yard, such as the brickmakers, labourers, carpenters, smiths or wheelwrights, and the intended use of those products, as well as government labour being allocated across the settlement. So while we might conceive of the lumberyard industries as fairly spatially confined inside this workplace, there are some interesting ways to kind of map beyond the lumberyard itself. And the first is that these records list the convicts and their trade for some periods. And as soon as we have those people and their names, we can potentially access that biographical data and where they were living at that time as well. And I've said that this is the record of the first lumberyard because convict workers were living in town and travelling each day to the lumberyards in this period. But under Governor Macquarie, a second lumberyard was built, which included a complex of a prisoner barracks and lumberyard combined. And this was built, and by 1820, when I've got these records, men were already being confined to the new barracks at night as this structure was being built. So generally carpenters, labourers and learners were in the barracks. And those that were out of the barracks were lumberyard workers who were more skilled, and that included people like Robert Gore, who was a wheelwright, and a blacksmith, John Bradley. We can map the intended purpose of manufactured goods as well. So carpenters made, amongst many other things, tables that were sent to Sydney, so well and truly off this map here, and government coffins, which were used first sent to the government location, such as the hospital or the asylum or the female factory, before their final resting place back at the burial ground. The blacksmiths made nails for the military barracks and tacks for the female factory, which is further to the north of this plan. And labourers worked in the churchyard as well in this period. The second transcribed source is Roland Hassall's day sales books, and these list the purchaser, the goods, and their value of transactions in his store. And I've included here all Hassall's records for 1803 and 1804, which is again about 4,000 records. Hassall was, of course, only one of many storekeepers in Parramatta, and so it's worth seeing this as a small sample of one particular vendor in this period. The transactions from these are from the State Library of New South Wales from the page transcription platform, which is transcribed by volunteers, which is really important to the accessibility of these sources. And I've exported these as tabulated data and have been working on identifying, firstly, the people, so who is in the store, their purchases, including the value and amount of those items, and then a further classification of those objects. And I use an archaeological method of functional analysis, so looking at what function these items serve. So in this case, calico is for sewing and tea is for food and beverages. We can now add this information to people who we have mapped into that landscape. So going back to Sarah Braben as an example, on the 3rd of October 1803, we know she took home to her allotment 3 yards of calico worth 8 shillings 3 pence and 2 pounds of tea worth 15 shillings and 14 pence. These are in fact 2 of 63 purchases made by Mrs. Braben over this 2-year period. So coming back to Hassall store records, we've now matched 104 households as household purchases to these land allotments, leaving us with just over 2,500 transactions that we've been able to map. And the results of the maps look like this. This is the known extent of mapped shoppers at Hassall store surrounding the area of Parramatta. So the colours here show the amount of money they spent in Hassall store. The darker the colour, the more they spent in that 2-year period. And that's in pounds. We can also convert that to shillings spent per transaction, which corrects for the frequency of how often they're visiting the store and gives us a better proxy for their wealth of those people. This is the same data, this time zoomed in to show only the CBD. And throughout this presentation, I'm overlaying this with my Hassall data with historical plans, in this case from 1804, which is directly contemporary with Hassall's store. If you take away that base plan, the data doesn't make a lot of sense. Just for context there. So you'll see a slight misalignment between the plan and the drawn allotments that we've shown here. And this is intentional. The location of leases are drawn from many sources, and we're trying to capture that as accurately as possible, which means that there's some messiness when you actually stick other plans behind that data. You'll see also that there are lots of gaps between allotments. So each of these little rectangles probably had people living on them. The darker bits are the buildings on those allotments, and there's lots that don't map here. So what that means is either those people didn't frequent Hassall's store, so we don't have the records in that sense, or they're people that we're not able to map because we don't know their names. Many people in Parramatta in this period lived under permissive occupancies, so without a documentary record for us to know who they are. That is just the nature of these kinds of fragmentary sources that we're working with. The map shows the purchased goods where they flowed to, but another factor is where they came from, which is Hassall's store. The consensus is in general that Hassall's store was located about here. However, he only leased this allotment from 1805 and the records start in 1803. So it's possible he leased it a little bit earlier, more unofficially, or if he potentially held the store at one of his other locations that he and his family occupied as well. So here again, we have the average shillings per transaction as a proxy for spending power, this time overlaid with the status as convict, emancipist, free settler, civil servant, or military officer. Larger allotments at the edge of town generally spent more, which fits with their status as major landholders and free persons. And smaller allotments had this kind of mix of convict, emancipated, and free occupants with similarly mixed spending patterns. If we look at the spending patterns in more detail, we can see on particular accounts, for example, Thomas Mackenzie, who was a convict barber, he purchased food, tea, and tobacco over a 12-month period, and soap, so fairly modest items for everyday life. In contrast, the Marsden family were prominent people in Parramatta and successful farmers. They were also very close to the Hassall family. Their children married in years later in 1822. So the Marsdens bought a wide variety of products from the store, like these examples here, which shows their wealth and also some of their personal habits. So potentially things like literacy through the paper and ink and powder, and the consumption of alcohol, cider glasses, and a decanter shown there. In the interest of rounding out this reflection on status and spending, though, we can look at others who don't fit this kind of convict settler divide quite so neatly. An example is Michael Nowland, who was convicted of highway robbery and stealing and gelding and was transported to Australia on the Second Fleet. He went on to be a pig farmer on his own piece of land. And you can see from his purchases here that he's buying slightly fancier goods, not just the daily food and soap, but at modest prices. So he's still got a relatively low spending per transaction occurring. Also, free settler William Sherwin and his partner Mary Duggan, they were purchasing buttons, fresh figs, and ribbon. So not exactly everyday basics, but only small items as well. Another interesting pattern relating to status is how Hassall referred to the buyers in his books. So as patrons entered the store, we can think of Hassall and the other keepers that worked with him as writing down those people and their purchases. And he potentially had the choice to write them down in the way that Hassall considered proper. So free people were listed with a title such as Mrs. or Captain, but those who were convict or emancipated were only listed by their first or sometimes just their last name. And the actual wording of these is shown here. So that's the same as the wording that's in the original transcriptions. There are exceptions, and generally very wealthy emancipists or those with absolute pardons were given a title. So Mr. James Lara and Mr. Michael Nowland are some examples. In contrast, Thomas Halfpenny was a Marine who came free, and his wife Catherine was a convict, but she was described as Mrs. Halfpenny and Thomas just as Halfpenny. So we can see that Hassall is probably considering the status of his clients on a daily basis, but there are clearly complexities to that status at this time. Another interesting thought is it's possible that Hassall wrote down the names as they were given by the patron. So potentially that title or not was self-assigned and not a judgment by Hassall at all. So what does all this mapping actually mean as we try to grasp the work habits of people more than 200 years ago? I want to frame this research briefly through a spade, a needle, a crock, and a table. So these are things, and they each anchor a connection between places, people, and things. You can think of these as a thing theme that help us to see objects not as static relics of the past, but as vibrant things that were entangled in people and their everyday habits. So for the remainder of this presentation, each of these thing themes I'll introduce with a Van Gogh painting that reflects the historical industry or labor that I'm connecting it to. Before Van Gogh was painting the bright sunflowers you're probably familiar with, he was painting the everyday lives of agrarian peasants in a period that's almost contemporary with Parramatta, slightly later. I've chosen his work because to me, it expresses a feeling or a character that helps me connect with these people and their labor in this period. So starting with the first one, a spade. We assemble things in common with the kind of agricultural township that we know of Parramatta. And this is probably the industries we think of. It's those convicts working hard. There is in this example a spade, but maybe it's also a hoe or a hammer or a spoke shave. It's the visible public labour predominantly performed by convict men. The spade cleaved the earth apart in an act of colonisation to create these colonial homes and the world around them, and forever altering the homelands of the Darug people through that process as well. This map shows the densities of items sent from the lumber yards to the government locations across the settlement. This is in 1811 and 1812. So you can see this is around Parramatta as well as further afield, including Toongabbie, Liverpool, Castle Hill and Sydney. And it shows a domination of self-sufficiency as the mentality of that labour. Products made in the lumber yards were predominantly used in the lumber yards, but these records also show a flow of objects elsewhere. So at government sites, the lumber yard also serviced civil servants in key positions. So these convict workers were often getting wood for Mr. Marsden, Mr. Hadley, Alt, Eccles and Davies, showing this kind of helping these senior people in the government as part of their daily work. Some activities also show decline. So for example, dismantling hoppers at the brewery when this site started to cease operation. Similarly, goods were reused. So things like door hinges moved from the brewery to the provision store. And another kind of thing they're making is for wider transport. So things like packing cases for beef for the export of those products to England. So thinking further afield, building products that potentially end up very far away. A decade later, this landscape looks pretty similar, but it has some differences too, most notably reflecting public construction, famously directed by Governor Macquarie at this time. And we can see Government House, which included actually within that complex stables, a dairy, kitchen, a domain, and the house itself. And it's a still standing place that you can visit now. It was pulling in more resources from the lumberyard than it was in 1811. The new female factory was also under construction, so it moved from being above the jail just across the river to much further to the north. And there's materials being put into those spaces, as well as a dam on the Parramatta River as described in these records too. The brick makers were also now in operation a little bit further along at Claycliff Creek, and the tasks reflect common manufacturing techniques. So dried grass was incorporated as a binder in clay, pugging before it was moulded. The sandstock bricks were moulded, and these records indicate they were making 22,000 bricks a week, and they're also setting and burning the kiln. And across the whole 2-year period, carpenters, sawyers, smiths and blacksmiths were building 2 new spires for the church as well. We can now move on to the assembling around a needle. So Hassall's records show that 1,744 needles, approximately, were sold to patrons in this period. And this represents this kind of industry of sewing. Sewing was an activity that was done within the home, and tailor shops both and in tailor shops, and both men and women were performing these tasks. There were male tailors in Parramatta, we have records of those, but women were likely the key cohort performing sewing within the home. This is a graph that shows the total shillings spent divided by the functions or purchases from the store. So this is across all people buying goods. There is a huge variation we can expect between individual households and their purchases, but we can see from this, this kind of averaging out process, some that are important across everyday business for most people. And one of the most notable here is in brown, which is those used for sewing. And this list of products that you can see here is the types of things that were sold by Hassall in this 2-year period. What you don't see on this list is a tape measure, and that's because they weren't invented yet. So body measurements for tailors were taken with paper ribbons with their own special markings of non-standardized units of measure on those. The range of fabrics, I think, is actually kind of beautiful. Hassall actually notes a lot of detail about the cloth, such as the colors, the fineness, the broadness, what kind of patterns, or the presence of print. And this range reflects a knowledge and therefore interest in sewing across all of these households in Parramatta. And Hassall was clearly meeting market demands for diversity in these items. This map combines all of the shillings per household spent on sewing, and that's the area, the colour that's outlined of each of these blocks, and the average shilling spent per sewing item is in the centre. And we can see that from these representations that the Abbotts, the Williamsons and the Crooks, for example, spent quite a lot overall on sewing, but per item they weren't spending very much. So that's a lighter centre with a darker edge, and that suggests potentially a household making frequent but lower quality purchases. And in contrast, the Pipers and Mrs. Hassall, so that's Roland's wife, were infrequent buyers, but they bought expensive sewing goods in those transactions. And so that's the darker centre with a lighter edge. And so what we can see is there's actually a huge amount of potential within these sources to explore spending power across households and looking at those in different ways. Many women were labouring within Parramatta and mostly within the home, and this work is traditionally not very visible in documentary sources, except for in the cases when we have government labour records, such as within the female factory. This map shows the households where I could identify women present. So this is beyond the factory walls, showing the percent of those transactions recorded as being made by women in each household. So of all those household transactions, how many of those were by women? While men were almost exclusively holding the leases and grants, so their names are on the titles, the database infrastructure we've built here helps us link in and therefore see those women. Generally, the women in free households, the landowners, appear more frequently to make these transactions. So the darker colour generally relates to these free women. In contrast, convict couples, shown here as Hassall did without a title, it appears more likely that that men were doing the shopping in these instances. There is some variation across these habits, but this is a trend that we're generally seeing across these records. Further out of town, men almost exclusively made the purchases. So this is zooming out a little bit, that same data set, with a few wealthy outliers like Mrs. MacArthur and Mrs. Kent. And this possibly suggests women stayed more regularly on their properties while the men travelled to town for business. Here are some of the items that were purchased that might relate to domestic labour more generally. And we commonly think of women, especially convict women, as living as domestic servants or confined within the factory walls of the female factory. But this research is really showing that women are doing a variety of things, living in lots of different circumstances across this landscape and contributing more broadly to everyday lives in other ways. The next theme I want to touch on is the crock. These are things in use potentially over decades for things like stirring or storing or fermenting, so associated with food. Let's return to the graph showing the household spending by function of the goods sold, and in this case looking at food purchased. So that's represented by this list of items that were sold in Hassall's store and quantified by the section of this pie chart in green. In contrast, we can look at the things that we use to cook and serve food, which is this tiny wedge here, shown in blue. And this is a very real reminder that the majority of the stuff that we excavate, the plates, the cups, the bowls from kitchens and tables, represent only a very tiny portion of the purchased items, because these goods were used and reused every day for food consumption. So I'll focus a little bit on the archaeology of Parramatta itself here. This graph shows the relative amounts of lead glazed and locally manufactured vessel shapes at 3 particular convict hut sites. And there's a clear difference here between just focusing on Area C, which is shown in blue, which is a hut that dated to around 1792. And you can see some of the examples of the pottery we found, these kind of coarse, large wares, and the dominance in the functional categories there of crocks and pots and pans. And in Area B, which dates closer to Hassall's store, which is around 1804. And by this time, there is a notable diversification in the forms that we can see. So things for individual use, including dishes and bowls and cups, and even children's tea sets. So Area C, that earlier one, reflects these habits, these earlier habits of communal foodways, perhaps shared for government rations or hung over a pot over an open fire, or later eaten with wooden mess kits. There are no individual settings at these tables. It's hard to see exactly how they were used because crockery shapes, things like giant or large bowls, had lots of purposes within the home. Later, occupants in Area B instead had their tables set with individual settings. So we can see things like a cup and a bowl and a spoon at those tables. This list here represents the food preparation and service items that were purchased in store that reflects this trend towards individualization. These changes may be seen as kind of minor, but it's really important to show this transition to individual or segmentations of life. By the 1800s, the material culture was being regulated. There was more things available and people had these choices to regulate human behavior more clearly. And you and I now know what a tureen or a side plate or a teacup looks like because they were being standardized in their form and the associated function throughout the 19th century. And this is what we see reflected in those ideas and in the archaeology that we can see associated with it. So this material shift represents an ideology of separate rooms for eating, sleeping, cooking, and working, of separate items for children, and of food consumed as individuals. The primary purpose of ceramics like crocks was preparing and storing and serving food. And so far I've spoken about those items in that way, but we can also think about the foundations of Parramatta as fairly agrarian and therefore consider food grown. So we had barley and ducks, fowls, figs, lemons, maize, pigs, potatoes, and wheat that were all sold to Hassall from farmers in the region. And this map shows the shillings credited to growers for wheat sold to Hassall, which is the most common agricultural product made in this period, or grown. And although this payment was actually sometimes exchanged for goods rather than cash in store, sometimes Hassall allowed large accounts to be left in arrears. So crops ripened and were harvested. And then the debts would be paid. So as an example, in 1804 in November, Hassall agreed that William Blady was to pay a debt of £2.50, and this was for 4 pairs of trousers and green Kersmere cloth, in wheat or barley in February next at storehouse price and delivered in Hawkesbury or Parramatta. So the wheat grown across the country was necessary to feed the wider population, but we can also see that it kept households economically stable and comfortable as well. So here we have our final assemblage of things centered around a table. The ideas of segmentation that I mentioned about crocks and dishes, this occurred at the table setting, and we can see individual settings being introduced through products on the table. But segmentation also spread more widely across life and work. Convict huts were initially designed to be communal spaces with gangs of huts in just 2 rooms, but we can see an increasing separation of spaces over time. So emancipists and settlers added more rooms and outbuildings and shops and stores, all for particular purposes. And this separated working life from the home life and produced these controlled or standardized workplaces, places like the lumber yards. And eventually this standardization even extended to convict domestic life when they were confined within the barracks. So despite this shift, or perhaps because of it, domestic work became relegated to the home zone and lost its kind of status as recognised or visible labour. And this issue is still forefront in society today, with the lack of recognition of domestic labour as work. In centering the table, I'm highlighting a time when separation was indistinct but developing. A tension between work and domestic spaces existed because these ideals were changing. On one side, we have the visible labour done in the fields and the industry workshops, and on the other, we have this work done inside the home and the allotment. We can also see standardised manufacturing and standardised products versus the homemade or traditional crafts, and those tensions are clear in the landscape. We can get a glimpse of some of the habits of people inside their huts. We might imagine them working or playing with their children, eating or talking around a table. And one visible habit is tobacco smoking. So this here is mapping the shillings spent on tobacco of different households. And this is what tobacco pipes look like in Australia in this period. We find them on almost every excavation in Parramatta. And while we might see that these households might have acquired their tobacco elsewhere, I think it's helpful from this to see that it's not a universal habit, but a consumer choice made by individual people. Much of the domestic labour may have been around the table, but it was directly related to this kind of complex economy we see playing out. Stores and pubs in this period have served an important point of exchange. So they create almost a cashless economy in the absence of banks. Hassall store functioned as a means of households to pay debts, not just to Hassall, but to other settlers as well. And we can look at that here. This is the transactions I've classed as economy, so relating to settling debts or withdrawing cash, or of labour, so selling particular services. None of these transactions involve physical goods. We can start to understand the complexity of these transactions. Thomas Mackenzie, who we've already met, who was the barber, was cutting the hair for the whole Hassall family, and he was credited for that labour. George W. Evans paid Hassall to arrange a boat crew to take his wheat elsewhere around the colony on his behalf. The Grahams paid a washerwoman, meaning other households were credited for their labour in washing. William Abbott paid Hassall to take him by horse and chaise to Sydney. Mrs. Braben exchanged or withdrew 6 shillings in copper and put that against her account. And Thomas Halfpenny paid James Wright for an unknown debt, but by paying credit against Wright's account in Hassall store. And these transactions show men and women at work, not just in the lumberyard, but in the homes and messily kind of across this landscape more broadly. So to conclude, we can start to see these complexities of this kind of movement of things around Parramatta, and particularly through these amazing archival sources held by the library. The lumberyard returns and Hassall store records potentially change how we think about individuals and their domestic spaces. We get a firmer picture of colonial lives, hunched around a table, spooning food from a crock, pulling a needle through cloth, or cutting earth from a spade. We can think about or see the connectivity of households to these other people and places, and the diversity of labour activities in action. From mapping these sources, we can see lumber products that were generally serving for government or civic purposes across the landscape. We can also see Hassall store as the free labour market, more clearly involving convict and emancipated and free people, as well as men and women. And we can also look at the goods grown and extracted from the land that entered the market via Hassall store. And through these processes more broadly, we can see this connectivity to a wider environment. So the natural resources, things like milled trees and quarried rocks and domesticates grown, and the role of the river in that landscape as well as a way of transporting goods to Sydney and beyond. Industries and commerce are complex, even in these kind of small scale settlements in the 1800s. So certainly we did have convict men working in the fields as labourers, but also women at work and domestic labour, and a diverse range of tasks and goods all moving about the settlement. We can kind of see this as a much busier place because of this work. So dining now with your knife and fork and a napkin potentially, or having a daily commute to work, or profiting from the labour of others. These were ideals that were thrust upon these people in this kind of emerging capitalist society at this time. And we can see that playing out in the materiality of Parramatta. And this is worth our attention because while this is relatively new to these settlers, these ideas, many of these notions and the underlying ideology of that is still with us today. So while we take for granted that this is how the world operates, that we live in a capitalist society, looking at these behaviours, they help us see the opportunities to understand a little bit more of their impacts on us and our daily lives here in the present. So hopefully it's clear that this research brings together methods and sources in different ways, but there are a lot of other ways that we could use this infrastructure, and the goal is to actually share this data more widely. I'm sincerely grateful to the State Library of New South Wales, its staff and the benefactors, the Hertzberg family in particular, for making this research possible. And I'd like to thank my co-researchers who assisted me in this work and have shared a lot, as well as volunteer transcribers for the data that they've generously helped produce. A final thing to note is that the transcription process is ongoing. You can take a look at these records yourself. They're available on the State Library of New South Wales from the page transcription website. You can sign up and transcribe, but you can also look at those to see those digitized sources. So yeah, that's all from me. Thank you for your time. Pull this back up.
That's all from me. That's a huge, it's an absolutely huge amount of work. If people have questions, a few questions are already coming through, please use the Q&A feature and we'll get through as many questions as we can. We have about 15 minutes for discussion. Some of the earlier questions that are coming in are related directly to your career as an archaeologist. What has been the most exciting find for you on a dig? Because we all see archaeology, right? We all see it in glamorous books and reimagined by Hollywood. It just looks so wonderful and dramatic. But as your disgruntled photo earlier in your presentation shows, maybe this is not quite the case. But have you had that sort of
Thank you.
exciting moment in the field?
I think I've had a lot, and it's funny, that's the question I probably get asked the most about my work. And my point is, I think you've very rightly picked up that the work is a lot hotter and harder than it looks. And the nice life with fancy gold objects and museums and those spaces is not quite the reality of most archaeologists who work around Sydney. And I know some are listening in today will probably say the same thing. But I think overall, it's never really been about particular finds for me. There are interesting things that I have pulled out of the ground at different points in time, particularly thinking about any object that was held by someone in the past. Like potentially the last person to put that in the ground was 200 years ago, and it relates very personally to them as people. There's lots of examples, tobacco pipes, any of these objects relate to individual people, and in that kind of connection to them in a more like emotional ways is kind of nice to have in archaeology. But in general, it's kind of more about what we're finding out. And the bit that captures me, hopefully it's clear from this work, is chasing these avenues and putting this all together in a bigger picture is, I think, much more enjoyable for me, is kind of what it all means.
Another very specifically on-site question, and you've touched on it a little bit there, is especially for a place like Parramatta, which you noted is been developed and then redeveloped and excavated and changed. How do the various layers, so how do more recent layers of material culture that's left behind confuse or compromise what you're looking for in the years that you're actually trying to investigate?
That's a future angle of research for me that I'm kind of narrowing in on now, is this idea that we have these earlier periods that look and feel in a particular and distinct way. It's very fragmented evidence, those post holes, those pits. It's all like bitsy piecey little bits, but it's right at the bottom of those sites. And it's the little smears of those kind of messages and people's lives in the past that we're picking up when we get down to that stuff. But absolutely, there is so many layers of stratigraphy, different periods of time that we might think of as disturbances that might have impacted that, but they're also valid for our study as well. And there are many people looking at later periods across the 19th or 20th centuries that help us understand particularly things like migrant experiences and the diversity of cultures in Parramatta. Lots of different ways that we use that evidence as productively as this particular period. For me, it's just easy to focus on one period of history, and the early one is interesting because it's so fragmented, and the documentary evidence is also very fragmented. So it kind of all comes together in tandem, and that's a 3D puzzle that is different for every site in Australia.
So this is kind of a quirky question. Someone is saying that they did an archaeology degree and it potentially was not presented in such an interesting way. So will you be deploying this work, this layering work that you've done in the classroom to make these archaeological sites not only more real for historians and people who are generally interested, but actually as a teaching tool?
Yes, I really have been enjoying teaching. I've been teaching the last few years in the university sphere, and I find that I think as all academics do, they use their research and their lived experience as archaeologists in the classroom. And I feel like my passion probably translates into a lot of animated and kind of crazy representations of that history and that past. But I think it is important. I teach these examples, and particularly for me, though, the important thing is connecting it to the present. Archaeologists, we think about this past as this distant thing that's far away from us, but a lot of what I'm doing is connecting that up. Why do we do this now? Why do we care about this now? And the more we focus on development and change in society, the more it's important, I think, and the more we hold on to different periods of the past, and kind of exploring that relationship and that dynamic of what it means for us now is the space that I find kind of most liberating and useful about this kind of work.
Because somebody has just asked, um, what sort of new questions does this research and the results you've found so far actually raise for you? Will you just keep, not just, that was a bit dismissive, will you keep adding data in as more and more records are transcribed or become available, and do you answer your current questions more comprehensively or over a longer period of time, or will you start to actually ask very different questions?
I think that in part that's about the data and what's available, and that's why this period is really of interest to me, because it's so fragmented. The questions you can ask are limited and need to be thought of in particular ways. I think that there is opportunity for both, and certainly Nick Pitt, who I mentioned, who's a co-collaborator on much of this work, he and I have talked a lot about what we could do as this infrastructure grows and the more data we add in. The next phase for me is I've integrated some of the excavations. You could see some of that material evidence in this kind of work, but Parramatta has a huge legacy of excavations, and getting that data into this kind of spatial network and connecting up all of those excavations, or as many of them as we can, will give us answers, I think, more detail and more interesting stories about people and narratives about this kind of busy life that's happening. But I also think that for me, the focus is going to probably move into this space about materiality, the way that stuff changed and this kind of connection to capitalism in particular, what that looks like for convicts and what that looks like for free people, what that looks like and how it's quite later than other places. So for example, in North America, these similar looking archaeology happens 100 years earlier. And that is potentially because we have this process of colonization. And as that moves around the globe, we kind of reinvent that agrarian capitalist transition, and we kind of redo that materiality. So looking, potentially including Brisbane, Sydney, or other places like Norfolk Island, tying in, looking at what that really early period looks like. Is there more similarities even though they're at different periods of time, or are they really different? So look, lots of ideas about where this future of research will go, and I think it'll be a matter of what I have time for, which is always the challenge.
And somebody's asking, this might be slightly a tangent to the core of the work that you're doing, but they were very intrigued about some of the public artworks that you were discussing and asking if you might be involved in those sorts of projects, either previously or if you would like to be involved in those sorts of projects, and just some of the complexities that you might speculate around collaborating with First Nations owners of place, and how specifically that one artwork that you showcased that had the landscape, but then superimposed on that these objects from colonial Parramatta and those signs of colonisation, and actively trying to change who lives there and how they live there, and how important you think that is for these really important public discussions about how we've changed the areas, and as Parramatta, which most of us would take for granted.
Yes, absolutely. There's quite a few parts to that question, I think. The first part about art in particular, I do think that it's important we think creatively about archaeology. So some people are more focused on the kind of more direct research outputs in more traditional ways. But I think that we can think about this more broadly, and the forms of art that we have and the ways that we can express and connect with the past. We can be really creative in that. And I think that example from those First Nations artists of that reinterpretation of that material, what it means to them, and connecting those stories together, I think that gives us a kind of more more nuanced and more interesting version. We think of this as part of the humanities rather than the sciences. We're thinking about this in enriching our life, so understanding history in whatever way we want to connect with that. I think that's helpful, and it gives us what I would call multiplicity, different ways of bringing in different narratives into these spaces. The other component of that in terms of First Nations histories, I didn't get into that in this presentation, and I haven't spoken directly with many researchers who are direct researchers in Parramatta, but that's one of the next stages of this project and this work, is to potentially use this infrastructure. And we can see the potential here of looking at Aboriginal entanglements and engagements in this landscape and mapping those as part of this work. That has got to be community-led research. It's got to be what those researchers would like to use this kind of infrastructure for. And I hope that I can build that, that research network to make that happen in the future. But I think it's really important to write those Indigenous histories into this colonial period. Archaeology has a really bad habit of separating out the Indigenous past as pre-colonisation and the Indigenous present, but we miss that bit in between, in which we cover in historical archaeology. That's a space for Indigenous researchers and Indigenous stories to be told as well. There's people and beautiful richness to explore there. And some pretty confronting and some pretty challenging histories as well as that, fully acknowledging that. But it's I think there's a lot more we could do in that space, and I'd really like to end up there too.
And somebody's asking if you can add a couple of industries, animal husbandry, so that's something quite small and achievable, but if there were slaughterhouses in that area at the time. And they've also suggested it might be interesting to look at tallow manufacture and candles, especially. That would actually be quite interesting, because you were talking about, those literacy activities and who can afford to read after dark.
I always often think of that when we see candlesticks.
That could be fun.
Which is one form of pottery we get in that early pottery, is the candlestick shape, and what that represents in terms of those kinds of, the way that I think that gives us also a connection more to that space and what it felt like in like a flickering candlelight. It's quite interesting. Yeah, so one of the projects we'll be working on, apart from the women space and exploring that a little bit further, is looking at the kind of movement of industries across the landscape. We were considering talking about timber in particular, the extraction of that wider landscape, and the bringing of those that wood into Parramatta and what that means for the settlement. But absolutely, animal husbandry and tallow manufacture and those kinds of spaces would equally work. So yeah, lots of potential, but yeah.
Pop it on the list. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Such a fantastic project, Katie. I'm so glad that you were the one to set this question and to answer it, because you've done a magnificent job and you have the experience, and of course those networks who have been pitching in and really bringing this project and the results to life. A big shout out to all my colleagues here at the library and the volunteer team and all those busy transcribers. That was not an easy collection to transcribe, because it's tabulated data. It's not nice, neat diary entries or letters home to mum and dad. So a big shout out to them. And of course to Dr. Caitlin DeGlewis for making it all happen. Please join us next time. Fellows Findings on the 1st of April at 11 o'clock. The listing is available online now, so you can book in and put it in your diary. David Turner will be here. He's doing another big data project. He probably has a few more spreadsheet entries than even Katie, I would dare say. He's looking at the big picture of Australia's historic merchant fleet and some absolutely fascinating insights into the how and when and the factors that led to shipwrecks. So I hope to see you next time for all things nautical on Fellows Findings. Until then, stay safe, everybody, and I'll see you online or on site at the library soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.